Shri P.V.N.M. Sharma asked, "You have established that the sacrifice of the fruit of work, which is the donation of money to God, is greater than the sacrifice of work, which is service of God. But renounced saints and poor people have no money to sacrifice, so they can only serve God. In that case, will people not feel that God and salvation have gone into the hands of rich people who have plenty of money to sacrifice?" Swami replied, "O learned and devoted servants of God, Hanuman did the sacrifice of work or divine service to God Rama, which is karma sannyasa. The Gopikas sacrificed the fruit of their work to God Krishna by giving him butter, which was their hard-earned wealth. The sacrifice of the fruit of one's work is called karma phala tyaga. Rama and Krishna were both incarnations of the same God Vishnu, so they were one and the same. The fruit attained by Hanuman as a result of his divine service was that he reached Brahma Loka to become the future Brahma or the creator. Thus he reached the same level as God. Vishnu Loka, the abode of God Vishnu, and Shiva Loka, the abode of God Shiva, are both at par with Brahma Loka. But the Gopikas reached Goloka, a new world created especially for them, and which is located even above the Brahma Loka. Goloka is said to be above the Vaikuntha Loka or Vishnu Loka. The reason God created the Goloka above his own abode is so that the most holy dust from the feet of the Gopikas will fall on his head. Hanuman became God by becoming the future Brahma, but the Gopikas surpassed even that status. God himself became the servant of the Gopikas. In fact, God Krishna had already shown a preview of the same by telling sage Narada that his headache would disappear only if the dust of the feet of the Gopikas was brought and applied to his head. All this clearly proves that the karma phala tyaga done by the Gopikas is greater than the karma sannyasa done by Hanuman. God is pleased with practical sacrifice, which proves the reality of a person's theoretical love. He is not pleased by the mere shaven head or the saffron cloth worn by the renounced saint. The householder doing both karma phala tyaga and karma sannyasa is greater than the saint doing only karma sannyasa. This is one angle. The other angle is that the householder prostrates to the saint because the saint could sacrifice all his worldly bonds for the sake of God's work, whereas the householder could not do that practical sacrifice. People need not feel that salvation has gone into the hands of rich people. If that were true, how could Sudama have gotten the topmost salvation, which is the grace of God? Sudama was the poorest of the poor. Also, why did Jesus praise the beggar donating 1 coin as the topmost devotee, even though there were several rich devotees who had donated hundreds of coins to him? God decides the value of the sacrifice not on the basis of the amount donated, but on the basis of the percentage of the person's total wealth that he has donated. The sacrifice of the beggar was 100%, because the 1 coin was all the wealth that he possessed. After donating it, he had nothing left with him. The sacrifice of the rich people was not even 1%, because even after donating hundreds of coins, they had plenty of wealth remaining with them. So God does not see what you have donated, but what remains with you after you have donated. For your donation of just 1 rupee to him, he will grant you the ticket right up to his own abode if no money remains in your pocket. On the other hand, even if you give him 100 rupees, while a few hundred rupees still remain in your pocket, he will only give you a ticket up to the next station located at just a walkable distance. Total surrender of everything to God is the real and ultimate sacrifice. This is what Lord Krishna means in the Gita when he says, Sarva Bhavena Bharata. There's a special method of worshipping God Venkateshwara, whose famous temple is situated on top of the 7 hills at Tirupati. This method of worship is called Niluvu Doppidi in the Telugu language, which means total robbing. The real meaning of this worship is that when the devotee sees God, the devotee is so filled with emotion that he naturally sacrifices everything he possesses to God. That is why this form of worship is called total robbing. It represents 100% sacrifice to God. But our clever people have conveniently twisted this mode of worship as follows. First, the devotee promises God in advance that he or she will worship God through this mode of total robbing, provided God grants a specific desired practical boon. The devotee does not do this total robbing in advance due to doubts in the mind. The devotee certainly wants the practical boon from God, but is not sure whether God actually exists or not, and even if God exists, whether he will sanction the desired boon or not. The devotee thinks, what if I were to donate everything possessed by me to God in advance, and then for some reason I do not receive the desired fruit from God? I cannot even complain to the temple authorities that I have been cheated by God. So the devotee does not take the risk of doing this total robbing worship in advance. The devotee thinks that it is better to make a deal with God in which God should first grant the practical boon, and only then will the devotee visit the temple for the total robbing worship. Alright, let us suppose that God sanctioned the desired practical boon to the devotee. The devotee then goes to the temple to perform the total robbing worship. But here too, the devotee is very careful. He or she goes to the temple with a very meager amount of money and wearing the lightest possible golden ornaments, so that the loss in the total robbing worship is almost nothing. Money is the strongest of the three strong worldly bonds, which include the bonds with money, one's children, and one's life partner. These three strong bonds are called the eshanas. God always tests whether your devotion to him is greater than the strongest of these three bonds. If the devotee succeeds in the test of the strongest bond, the other two bonds, being relatively weaker, need not be tested. There's a saying in Hindi that God resides in money. Paise mein Paramatma hai. This means that money is the strongest worldly bond, and hence God always competes with money. But as described above, it does not mean that the grace of God is directly proportional to the quantity of the sacrificed money. Sudama got the topmost grace of God just by sacrificing 3 handfuls of parched rice to God Krishna. The grace of God Krishna in return was also not theoretical. It too was practical. God Krishna too made a huge practical sacrifice of the fruit of work. He blessed Sudama with an infinite treasure of wealth. God has said that he responds to devotees in the same way as the devotees worship him. Ye yatha mam prapadyante tams tathaiva bhajamyaham. This is said in the Gita. We think a lot before sacrificing a bit of our wealth, even though we possess a lot. But Sudama sacrificed only a little. All he sacrificed was 3 handfuls of parched rice, and that rice too was got on loan from a neighbor. It was the climax of practical sacrifice of the fruit of work from Sudama's side. Hence, the fruit that Sudama received from God was also the climax of the sacrifice of the fruit of work from God Krishna's side. God Krishna gave his infinite divine treasure of wealth to Sudama. Even Saktuprastha was tested for his ability to sacrifice the fruit of work alone, and that too in an extreme condition. Saktuprastha and his family had been starving for several days owing to a severe drought. He had somehow managed to get a small quantity of flour to feed his family. God asked Saktuprastha to sacrifice that little food to him. Saktuprastha and his family, after due analysis, decided to sacrifice all the little food they possessed to God and were granted a place in Brahma Loka by God. Thus we see that God grants only theoretical fruit in return for a devotee's theoretical sacrifice, whereas God grants practical fruit in return for the devotee's practical sacrifice. Lord Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita that propagating divine spiritual knowledge pleases the Lord greatly. Jnana yajnena tenaham. Spiritual knowledge brings about permanent harmony and peace in the world. So join us in sharing this universal divine knowledge of Lord Datta and earn the highest grace of God.